Hey there, thanks for tuning in. If you're enjoying the podcast, hit subscribe and download the latest episode. And hey, do me a favor, share the podcast with your friends, family, colleagues, or anyone you think might be interested. Your support helps us to continue to bring you engaging interviews and discussions on your favorite books. Thank you. You're listening to Book and Lounge. I'm your host, Jacqueline. In this episode, I'm joined by Kay, Katrina, and Taiwo to unpack the themes and grapple with the hard questions that Gary Young so compellingly raises in his acclaimed work, Dispatches from the Diaspora. This collection of articles, written for various publications over a 25-year period, offers a reflective exploration of a wide range of themes, including the enduring presence of systematic racism and the lack of meaningful progress, the relevance and purpose of the Commonwealth and statutes, and the intersection between race and class. It also features a series of intimate interviews with a number of prominent personalities, from civil rights activist Angela Davis to acclaimed artist Stormzy, offering their unique and insightful perspectives. Gary Young's writing has a remarkable ability to make us pause and reflect on the realities that too often go unnoticed. Let's jump in and hear what everyone had to say.
I just wanted to start off by just talking about the division of the parts. Which part did you like the most or least, and why?
That's easy. The fourth part is where it really kicked in for me, that I started to really enjoy the book. I think because he chose interesting people, or people I'm interested in, and he started with the best, and he maintained that high level of consistency in terms of the quality of the interviewee. I mean, he's a good interviewer. I mean, I know that when it started, I think even before it started proper, when he was talking about traveling with the bodyguards, Nelson Mandela's bodyguards, and feeling quite tearful that his mum wasn't there to witness the August event of Nelson Mandela kind of ascending, as it were, to the seat of power after all those years of incarceration. I felt that he really knows how to capture the mood and the emotion of the time. I mean, he was embedded, and I really enjoyed the way he explained how he related to them and how they related to him. The whole business of his inability to, or his not having learnt to drive, and that creating some challenges, but at the same time, he turned the challenges into opportunities, that he would get these lifts from A to B, from B to C, and therefore make these personal connections with people that were giving him lifts. And these he threaded into his reports. So I really enjoyed that. But going back to what I enjoyed most, it was clearly the fourth part. That's where it really picked up for me. I liked the ending, the fifth part, but the fourth part for me was really the highlight. I think it was more to do with where my mind was when I was reading it than him as a journalist and an author. But the first three, I not that I struggled, but I just didn't enjoy them as much as really getting into the part four with the Mayor Angelou, and, even Lewis Hamilton, who I'm not a great fan of. I enjoyed, he gave me an insight into him. The way he did the interview, it was very even-handed. I kind of felt more compassion, because I've always, in the past, not now, but in the past, I've always been quite down on Lewis and, his tax affairs and, that kind of stuff. But then I started realizing from the way he interviewed him how difficult his life has actually been, although he's enjoyed so much success. I loved the Stormzy one as well. I thought it was just brilliant to see how committed he is to his art, and how broken he seemed when he thought he'd blown Glastonbury because of the equipment. I just loved the interviews. That's all I can say. I loved them.
I quite liked Ways of Seeing. I wonder if that's the section where you had this optimism, and that really came through. And then you had this sense of crash and burn, and he's talking about various incidents, particularly in the US, but Ways of Seeing, maybe that was the calmer reflection moment. Like there were he's talking about rights of a class act and what Black America means to Europe. I thought those were some really kind of introspective moments, which I think drew me to Gary Young as a writer in the first place. I mentioned before that particularly in The Guardian, so a number of years ago now, I remember following him as one of the authors on Comment is Free. I don't think so much now, but maybe 10 or so years ago, Comment is Free on Guardian was quite a popular site. And I'd regularly log on to that site, and I'd follow particular opinion writers, and he was one of them who I'd always want to read what he had to say. Some of what I liked about it came through in some of the in some of the pieces under that third section. The kind of the introspection, the stepping back, the offering two sides to it. And yeah, I was just looking back at lots of highlights and things I went to reread. It was in that section.
I was just looking at the contents list while you're talking. I certainly liked the section that Taiwo mentioned I love the Stormzy interview. I learned a lot from that I possibly should have known more about him before. And the lady, the first of the sort of bus protest ladies, the Claudia, I can't remember her name now. The section you're mentioning, the express not express yourself. Section 3.
Ways of seeing.
Ways of seeing. Yes, I found some of that very interesting. There's just lots. I found lots. I found the beginning where his experiences in South Africa at that early hopeful time, and then when it was things fall apart because I was interested to what he has to say in Comrade Bob. So just a lot of it. I couldn't pick out one section. And even when he's talk about himself, I found that very interesting to his own sort of personal experiences. So lots. Did you have a section, Jackie?
Yeah, I like majority of the parts. The only one that I struggled with is things fall apart. And that's because of the subject matter that he was dealing with in that section. So you had the downfall of, not really the downfall, but the decline of optimism in South Africa. You had a description of what happened, what was happening in Zimbabwe and the dire situation of the people in the country. And then you had the killings of Black people. And then also, again, Black Lives Matter and We Can't Breathe. So yeah, it was just really one after the other. And then after I just said, oh my God, not another book. That's just telling us how bad things are for us. But then after that, the ways of seeing, I really enjoyed how he was reflecting on all these things how we look at things, and actually how if we did away with some of the things, what society would be like. So I like especially the story of these statues, getting rid of all of them. I liked his reflection on if Boris Johnson was a Black woman. I think that was in that section. But yeah, so overall, it's a great collection. It really is. It's just that one section that when I was reading it, I was a bit down.
Well, I agree with you on that one. It just felt almost relentless, particularly when they're all together. Because if you think about when we experienced those, I don't remember reading all of those articles first time round, but you would have read them spaced out. But actually, that was the feeling that engenders when you're reading them all together. It's really depressing. And the one that has always stayed with me in so much as actually quite hurt me to read the story. And there was a time where I just couldn't bother. I just didn't want to engage with it. It was the one about Trayvon Martin. Just the details of that story. And that's not to suggest there aren't other stories and other killings which were unfair, which are difficult. But for whatever reason, that was the one that resonated with me. And maybe because I have a younger brother, and maybe the famous picture of him with a hood top. I'm quite sure my brother's got a hood top like that. So there are all those things playing into it. But what did come across is his power as a writer. I could actually feel his anger when I was reading it. It was visceral, the way he was describing it. So, but I do agree with you. It was depressing as well. Like, I don't understand how this is possible. I don't understand how a young boy could die and nobody thinks that his parents need to be informed. I don't understand how a young boy could be murdered and nobody's, arrested. I don't understand how somebody could be arrested, put on trial and found, all of those details. There doesn't seem to be any end to it. There doesn't seem to be any hope. So I think it was really important that he then did go on and reflect on some of those and provide a bit more introspection in his laters. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been a very enjoyable read, bringing those essays together.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing that I don't know if someone's already mentioned it, they're not really in chronological order. So they're kind of like taken from various periods. And I guess that was in essence to be able to theme them. Because I found myself going through them and then just thinking, hold on, what time period are we talking about now? At the beginning of each one of them, he has a quote, and then the year and the publication. So every time sometimes when I started one, I had to look back and say, okay, where are we now? So I think I initially struggled with that the fact that they were not in any kind of order. And I just wondered if you had any issues with that.
No, but you are saying that he did give context to each piece because he began by giving a date. And I mean, not that it was necessary, but he also provided the context of where it was first published, Esquire, GQ, The Independent, whatever. So he did give context to each piece. I think thematically works much better than time-wise, chronologically. And the fact that you can see over time how he's writing, if you really want to analyze it, how he's matured, how he's grown, or at least how he's changed. But I think it didn't cause me any problems at all, for me anyway.
Yeah, I found myself looking back to check sometimes when I was halfway through, but it didn't bother me. I didn't find it to detract from the series at all. But then I often have to go back because I've probably read the beginning too fast and I need to check what I've missed at the beginning. So I don't know. It's okay.
It was just me then. So I just want to go back to something that you said, Kay, about the things that fall apart section. And I guess the first question I want to ask, and this is regarding the value of Black life and whether in the course of the book we feel that there's been any change. I'll start by reading a quote from page 42, and this is the beginning of the essay. And it says, for Berthold Posey, a white man raised in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the Second World War had a civilizing influence. When I was coming up in Mississippi, I never knew it was against the law to kill a Black man, he says. I learned that when I went in the army. I was 17 years old. When they told me, I thought they were joking. So clearly, Black life hasn't really been valued in many parts of the US historically. And I just wanted to, I guess, discuss whether things have changed and how much things have changed. And also if we can compare that, again, based on some of the writings in his essays, we can compare that to the value of Black life in the UK. Stunned. Did that?
That's a harder question than you think.
Because you're thinking about it on levels, aren't you? You're thinking about it on the personal, but you're also thinking about it, the personal as in the individual human being. But you're also thinking about it on the, not so much corporate, what's the word? Like systemic, aren't you? The structural, the more maybe global, if you're looking at the UK and America.
There are these themes that come out. I think that's maybe, and actually to go back to your earlier point, one reason why I didn't mind that it wasn't chronological, because in my mind what he'd done is he'd laid out all his essays and then he'd kind of grouped together where he had certain themes, and it was almost more powerful that an article that he wrote in the mid-90s still resonated with one that he wrote in the 2000s, and you would have thought there would have been progress in that time, but there hadn't. But it's really hard because there are these themes that come out, particularly if you're talking about young Black men and their engagement with with police, for example. But then when you ask, has things changed? Well, they must have changed. Look at my own, personally, I look at the story of my own family. There has to have been progress, but sometimes it's hard to see it. The detail gets lost in these bigger thematic, and as Taiwo says, these systemic issues that just keep coming through. So it's really, you want to say yes, and then you read something like this and you go, I don't know.
That's the difficulty, isn't it? Because you read these and you just feel like nothing's ever fundamentally changing, although obviously on the surface it does. But then I was also struck by his article about life in America. He says, despite all this that he's reporting, he himself has had fairly minor issues on one or two different occasions. He listed some things, and he often in several essays he sort of talks about the British racism that he's used to and how he got used to the American racism, but there's nothing one isn't better than another. I felt he was very balanced the way he tried to handle the issues, because it is sometimes when you read the news and you read his articles one after another, you want to despair, don't you? But we shouldn't.
I agree with you, Katrina. I think he's very even-handed when he writes his articles, which is surprising because, as Kay was saying, sometimes he can come across as quite passionate and angry. At the same time, he does kind of cool down and still bring about that reasoning to the situation. I mean, there was that instance when he was saying he had that not confrontation, it's almost like a microaggression, but it could have degenerated into something awful potentially, where he's like flashing his journalistic pass or journalist pass, and that the police are turning him around saying, no, you can't come through for whatever reason. And then the officer is kind of laying his hand on his gun or patting his gun or something like that. And it was almost chilling the way he's almost like the wheels of his mind are working. If this black person who claims to be a journalist, even if he is a journalist, if he doesn't turn around, well, I may have to draw my weapon. I'm thinking, but why even thinking that? So he turns around. The other instance as well, which made me feel sad, to be honest, where he's talking about his child. Well, there were two there, weren't there? Where he's talking about one of his, I think maybe he has two sons. Or is it a son and a daughter? I can't remember. But anyway, the child had inadvertently sprayed some water on some woman, and the woman's kind of raging at the child disproportionately to what had happened. And he steps forward and says, look, it was an accident, etc., etc. And then she starts shouting on him, doing a
Karen.
I think I knew it was a K. I think it can't be Katrina. So
No.
yeah, she was doing a Karen. And then who are you? Who are you? And it's like, I'm the boy's father. You're nobody. You're nothing. And it just seemed for me, it felt very hurtful the way she behaved because of that mindset, the way of thinking. You are nothing. What is it? What is it? What makes a person behave in that way? What makes a person think in that way? What makes a person kind of just lose control of their emotions in that way? And it really saddened me. And then the other one, sorry to just drone on, but the other one was just when his son was asking about, if we take this away, the police stop all these young black boys. He says, well, that's because they've probably done something like that. And then the boy says, what did he say? He says, well, why would they stop us or something like that? And the next day he can't remember all the details.
Yeah, I think the police were stopping black people, and then he said that they're not going to stop us because we haven't done anything. And then he asked his father, but why are they? What have they done? And he couldn't answer that because probably they hadn't done anything, but they were still being stopped. Then he changed the route.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, I just really struggle just going back to the question. Well, things have changed, but actually things haven't really changed because the language is still the same. The views that people hold about migrants and migration, despite the contributions that migrants have made in this country, the views are still the same. The only difference is it's not in your face like it used to, because back then the National Front would just come to you and start shouting at you, and there was absolutely nothing you can do about it. Now they can't do that because of all this hate crime legislation and so on. They can't do that as much. And also the police were really, really heavy-handed. I know they're still just as bad. Well, maybe not just as bad, but before they would just beat you and then absolutely nothing would happen. At least now there would be some kind of investigation. But this idea that the police are institutionally racist has been around forever. So for me, in this country, it just feels that things have moved on, but things really haven't moved on that much. And when I look at the US as well, I again, from reading these essays, and for example, he talks about the prison population, how the black people make, in most states, black people make a very small proportion of the population of the state, but you'd find that they make the majority of prisoners of people incarcerated. Same as level of wealth, level of education, black people are still predominantly at the bottom. So although things feel like they've moved on a bit, well, I guess black people are not being lynched anymore, but actually just systematically very little has changed. Yeah, I feel that there's still a lot that we need to do.
And that was the tough read of the book, I think. So Tyro's story about that individual, like where does that anger come from? The thing I think Gary Young does well is he talks about the wider context in which these issues take place. So we could, and I think it would be very easy to say that woman, she's very angry. There's, she felt it appropriate to talk to a child. Actually, there's a system that makes it okay for her to do that and has done so for a very long time. And I feel like that's what he draws out. So it's very easy to, okay, so these surface level things have changed. It's not appropriate to use the N word. It's not appropriate, encounters and behaviours and what they have to do. But the prison population is what you were talking about. It's still, there is still something systematic. The US, I remember a long time ago reading, it's quite a famous study, the school to prison pipeline, and how, particularly young boys in particular from ethnic minority backgrounds in the US, how they're over-disciplined, I think is the term they used. And anyway, it's a series of reactions or interventions from the state that eventually leads to many of them end up in prison, how they're isolated from the state and how they're, over-policed, over-disciplined. I think that's the sad thing, is that it's very easy to talk about these individual circumstances, and it's, almost, I don't know what that comment about the young man, I thought it was okay to kill black people and then I went to the army and then I realised it wasn't. Yeah, because there was a world that told you it was okay to do that. So you're just one person. Okay, you went and you fought in a war and you came out and you realised it wasn't okay. What about all those young white men who didn't go and join the war? It's still perfectly in their mind reasonable for that behaviour to take place. So I think that's what he draws out, that is quite powerful in Gary Young's writing, but also quite depressing. And another thing I took from his writing, and he confronts it quite directly, is that obviously he was a US correspondent and he was based in the US. But I do like that he acknowledges at one point that I probably know more about Black America than I do about Black Britain and the Caribbean. And I do think that's something that comes through, is that he talks about the dominance of kind of Black America as a minority and that narrative across the world. And it makes white Europeans feel comfortable because they can say, well, we don't do that. We're not that extreme. But actually, there's very little reflection more widely about, okay, so what does this look like in the UK? What do these challenges look like here? There's a big piece going on at the moment about maternal health in Black women, particularly in the US. There have been a number of stories about these perfectly healthy Black women who have, while giving birth, have just been ignored and they've ended up dying. There's, a few reasonably high profile Black women, and their stories are being told. Those numbers aren't particularly great in the UK, but we're so fixated on the American story, and it's so easy to distract ourselves to the American story that we then don't go, but yeah, in the UK, it's not great either. And there's something systemic going on over here. So I think that's what makes his writing quite good. It's depressing. He brings in all these other facets, and he's quite reflective in his writing as well.
I think it's because he gets people, doesn't he? He comes across as someone who has a lot of insight into the nature of human beings. He's observational. He very much studies people and tries to understand them, even if he doesn't agree with their politics or doesn't agree with their religious view or doesn't agree with them for whatever reason. But he seems to like people and want to try and understand them, and then he writes accordingly. I think on the individual basis, on an individual level, is that thing where you're looking at maybe the morality or the ethics of the person as one unit, even if they're swimming in a sea filled with people that all think a certain way. Yes, it's acceptable to kill a Black person because a Black person is lesser than the white person that is doing the killing or the community in which that Black person lives. But then you think that the structures that enable or facilitate such thought, they're changing, but not as fast as they need to change. Maybe it's the individual that needs to change much, much faster. And then the structures, the bigger structures would change as well. Maybe that's what will happen, if it happens at all. Who knows?
Katrina, you were saying something?
No, I'm not. No, I thought of something, but...
All right, then in that case, I'll move on. So I think there's a section where he's talking about the Caribbean, and then he's talking about the Caribbean islands wanting to break away from the Commonwealth. And I just wanted to touch upon the Commonwealth as a whole. Does it serve any purpose? What's the point of it?
Good question. Yeah, very good question. And yeah, many of you know about my former workplace, and the Commonwealth was every couple of years. I really should know this. You have the Commonwealth Summit where all the countries of the Commonwealth get together. I really do think it's a question that's been bubbling in the background for a long time. And I think as more time goes by, there's going to be a more discussion on, is this the thing that should hold us together? I do think there's an argument for communities of countries, like multilateralism. You know, we're much stronger together than we are apart. The roots of the Commonwealth, i.e. former countries of the British Empire, was always going to be problematic when you think of the history of that brought those countries together. And it's still something lots of people tussle with, although the Commonwealth has actually grown. There are countries that have wanted to have joined the Commonwealth that were never Commonwealth countries. So it's a weird one. And every so often there seems to be this wrangling about, does this still work? But it still continues. It's a strange one. And it's one of those conversations that no one knows how to have comfortably. What you're seeing now in recent years are these figures like the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, very strident, very confident in asking for reparations, in asking for support, climate justice. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear others' thoughts. Also, it was just reflecting on the kind of the Windrush scandal, and not when that started, but how it came to prominence. It came to prominence as a news story on the eve of the Commonwealth Summit that was held here. And it was almost a perfect storm. The story, when it landed, almost happened at the perfect time. Because here was the UK talking about the Commonwealth, and here we are all together and blah, blah, blah. And then a news journalist dropped the story, well, if you really care about the Commonwealth countries, why are you treating these people from Commonwealth countries in this way? So it's always been this, it feels like a unit of contradiction in some way.
Was it The Guardian that broke the whole?
It was. Not to say, I think that story broke for The Guardian in I think it's 2017 or 2018. But the scandal itself and what was happening to people had been happening for many years before. It was just never gaining any traction in the media. But yeah, sorry, that was a ramble. I didn't actually answer the question, but I did. Yeah, I understand it. I understand its benefits. And then I think I don't understand it at the same time, if that makes sense.
The benefits of the Commonwealth are questionable. I can understand that there's an advantage to small in terms of political and economic power and influence, small in terms of geographical size, for countries to band together. I mean, a classic is the EU, isn't it? I never really understood why the United Kingdom would want to leave a club where there's safety in numbers, there's unity in strength.
Can of worms.
Yeah.
Different conversation, different book club. Taiwan.
The point I'm making is that we are stronger together. But there are advantages in being part of something bigger than oneself. That's the point that I'm making.
What is the advantage of the Commonwealth? What are there economic benefits? What are the benefits? Because I don't know any benefits.
Well, that's the point. I don't know enough.
Trade on favourable terms because you're a member of the Commonwealth. You get, I don't know, you pay less tax on exports or imports. What are the benefits?
And that's a good point, actually, because I know that there was a time when the Commonwealth countries were favoured. And then I think the US, the UK used to favour trade with Commonwealth countries, I think over commodities like bananas, for example. And then the US said, no, you can't do that because we've got investments in these countries and they're being undercut. And in the end, they won. So it's a very rational question to ask, well, why are we part of this? For Commonwealth countries that are in the global south, which is the majority of them, right? But something that you are seeing more recently is other countries looking to form their own partnerships, particularly between the Caribbean and Africa. And to me, that's quite interesting because maybe they've got similar histories, but they've not really partnered before. But you are starting to see some of them band together and try to support tourism between those two countries, try to build their own economic ties and partnerships. I'm not going to say they're anything at the level that you see other partnerships, but it's an interesting conversation that this group within the Commonwealth is now starting to say, okay, so how can we help each other, excluding the UK or these other global north countries? But yeah.
I mean, I used to think the Commonwealth was just like empire in its modern form, and was there much point to it? But I'm think now any opportunity where people meet and discuss is a good one. And in terms of the domination of, obviously economically there's domination, but in terms of numbers, if you think of, the membership, I don't know how it all works, but I would have thought that everybody has an equal opportunity to speak, or is meant to. You're shaking your head, Jackie, so you could tell me in a minute how I'm wrong on that. But I just think that it will fall apart on its own accord if everybody wants to join. When I say everybody, say all the African ex-empire countries and other Commonwealth countries, if they want to join and make groups of their own and a mutual benefit that is much better, the Commonwealth will just die a death by itself, I would have thought.
The reason why I was shaking my head is not necessarily because I don't know whether everybody has an equal opportunity to speak. However, why is it that only the monarchy is the head of the Commonwealth? Why can't they rotate? If it was an equal organization, I would assume that they would have rotating leadership. But you do make a good point in relation to forming other alliances. So you have the BRICS nations, for example, and then now you have within Africa, all these regional countries are forming their own alliances. And also there's now talk about free trade between various African countries. And now that's been ongoing for a while. But I think these nations are beginning to realize that actually they need to band together in order to be able to fight against the dominance of the West. And coming back to the Commonwealth, I think it's a useless organization that should be disbanded.
Well, the point of that then I would have thought is that the other nations can leave. I mean, Zimbabwe left, and I presume everyone else is free to leave if they wish to. And is there no opportunity for those countries to influence the British, given that they're all, I suppose, countries who were in the past dominated by the British, and economically, I expect, by the West still. But in a sense, there should, in theory, be a sort of strength that they can band together to speak about things like reparations, if that's what the mood is. Do you get what I mean? In terms now, the so-called mother country should be well outnumbered by her children, who've grown up and ought to be able to tell her what they think. And if they do want to leave, I think they stay because they still think there is some benefit that can accrue from it. Not perhaps because they like it, but they see that there might be something in it for them. And it'll die its death, I think, if there isn't.
I think so. They have to get something out of it to stay. And like I said, countries that weren't part of the British Empire are now part of the Commonwealth. So I just looked it up, like Togo and Mozambique. They weren't Anglophone countries, but they decided to join. And one of the things I've heard, particularly with Francophone African countries, is maybe they find that there's more of a voice for them in the British structure. This sounds so archaic, but maybe they've got more of a voice within an Anglophone structure than they do within a Francophone structure. The French flavour of colonialism was very different to the British flavour of colonialism. Yeah, they have to get something out of it. Maybe it's all the other things that go with Commonwealth membership they see as a benefit. We'll take that. We'll put up with that as long as we continue to get those benefits. But if you didn't have the Commonwealth, I just wonder what would you have? So one area where I think you might find some really useful membership is around like small island development states responding to climate change, particularly out in the south, like Tuvalu countries and Vanuatu have got very similar or almost not, well, they're at the extreme end, but countries like islands like Antigua and other islands in the Caribbean, which are really being hit by climate change, coastal erosion, all those sorts of issues, the call for climate justice. So I wonder if the Commonwealth is better the devil you know.
Okay, I'll leave that question to hang. I'll move to the next topic. So in the essays, he writes a fair bit about Nelson Mandela. So the first essay is when Nelson Mandela is just campaigning. He's out of prison and he's campaigning. And then the next time he writes about him and South Africa is how things have progressed in South Africa after the ANC took over. I wanted to touch upon what he says about the optimism in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was out and how or why things haven't worked out. The hope that people were feeling at the time, why the hope hasn't materialized.
I've always felt that, of course, I know who Nelson Mandela is, but I've never maybe known as much about South Africa as others have. But to me, it does feel like Nelson Mandela in South Africa was the icon for a generation of writers. And Gary Young felt to me like he was of that generation. They would have come of age, they would have grown up watching Nelson Mandela on TV. So it was interesting to me that was one of the first, and he talks intimately about Nelson Mandela and that experience. So I felt I learned something there. He definitely feels to me as being that writer who, for him, that struggle maybe was a guiding principle and value.
Katrina, you wanted to say something?
Well, I'm just thinking about, not just South Africa and Mandela, but politics generally and the way the world works, that you can have these changes and everybody gets very happy and excited, like when Obama came in, like when Mugabe got pushed out more recently. I went to Zimbabwe just after that, and I've never seen the officials at the airport looking so happy and relaxed and smiling and welcoming for a very long time. But personally, I never have much hope for these things. I think the world has the elite systems of the world and the money systems of the world are incredibly difficult to shift. And they just reform themselves. I don't know an answer. I know it sounds very bleak, but I think it's impossible to expect that Mandela and the changes are going to achieve what the ordinary person who's been struggling for years is hoping they'll achieve. I think the step between where those people in the townships and their life, where it was, like everybody has access to television, so we all know what life can be like if you're one of the lucky ones in this world. But the gap is so big. I think it's very difficult in a few years to just bridge it. So that, to me, it's always obvious that these things are going to end in tears. Not that it isn't better. Of course, it's better to have universal suffrage and stuff like that in South Africa than the old system. But I don't expect it's going to do away with people's grinding poverty very easily and quickly. Of, revolution and change, really, and how effective it can be.
I just want to come back to one thing there. Redistribution of wealth. I don't feel that happened when Nelson Mandela took over. So the people that always had the wealth remained with the wealth. Do you not think that had he attempted somehow to redistribute the wealth, the Black people would have been in a much better situation than they are at the moment?
Well,
I don't think he was elected on that kind of a promise, though, was he? I think he was elected more to maintain or at least keep the peace, that there not be some kind of powder keg explosion. I think that was the ticket that he really came on. And I think it would have taken more than a term, probably more than 2 terms anyway, to even look towards the redistribution of wealth.
Maybe if you say when he negotiated the deal to come out, he negotiated on the basis that he wasn't going to rock the boat. When he was elected, Black people were expecting their lives to get better. That's the reason they voted for the ANC.
Yeah, but I agree with Katrina, though. The expectations, just like Obama, are unrealistic because people are so far behind socially and economically. But it's understandable why there is such a thirst and desire for significant change, which cannot be delivered anyway. I mean, unless maybe, or at least one way in which it could be delivered is if you have a strong man, but then you have to be willing to pay the price for your strong man, because the strong man, the Gaddafi, will come in and will affect significant change within, a short period of time, but there is a cost.
I can't say I can compare. I see the comparison between South Africa and the US. With Obama, when Obama came into a system that's been running for last 100 or whatever years, right? The structures are already there. You have two parties, and his hands were tied. He really couldn't effect as much change as he wanted to because of how the American political system is structured. In South Africa, the ANC took over. The ANC were the majority party. They had the mandate to effect change if they wanted to, but they didn't. Now, I can understand the argument that, if, they started nationalizing some of the companies, then the white people would leave and then they'll take their wealth with them. But that was the same argument that people had when Labour proposed all sorts of things in this country. The wealth will leave, or if we introduce 50% tax, then the wealthy people are going to leave and they're going to take their wealth. They didn't. They're still here. So I don't see. I just think that the ANC and Nelson Mandela could have done better for the Black people.
You're probably right, but I don't think that they could have completely achieved in a short space of time the sort of improvement in living standards and education and health for the mass to the extent that the people would have wanted it. That's my point, really.
Power since Nelson Mandela came out. They've had enough time.
Yes, but they obviously aren't trying, are they? I think in Mandela's time, in that first time, perhaps they could have done more, but they didn't for whatever reason. I think now, I don't think anybody's trying very hard, quite honestly. I think it's like everywhere else in the world where the rich get richer and the rest don't. I'm sure they could have done better. Surely at least it was an achievement to get from apartheid to something which at least gave everybody the opportunity to vote and have some investment in the power without a bloodbath. It wasn't that at least something good?
Yeah, I kind of see both of what's being said. It's that the transition, he delivered a peaceful transition. Maybe that's the most he was ever going to be able to do. I think that's what you're saying, Katrina. But I hear what you're saying, Jackie, about the lack of ambition and not being bold. I think you do have these leaders who come in and they do have a mandate, and you think, come on, be bold, do something. It's not going to be turned around overnight. But what would it look like to say, do you know what? I'm going to invest so much in education. I can't change everything that's gone before, but I'm going to make sure the next generation is set up. I'm going to make, free school meals for all kids. I'm going to make sure all kids are, get a decent education up until the age. It's that lack of, let's be bold, let's try and turn the dial. And they could have done more. And you're seeing the consequences of that now, and people not feeling like their situation has changed. It feels like a lost opportunity, maybe.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Kay, because it's almost like even if it's a single issue legacy thing, whether education or whether healthcare, universal healthcare, some things are fairly basic, but if you do it right across the board, you can make a difference within not just that generation, but the generation to come. And it can be quite difficult when you've laid that firm foundation, when you're out of power, because you're never going to last indefinitely anyway, that your political opponents can then undo the good work that the people have seen, the foundation that you've laid that should go on into the future. But as you're all saying, it's true, that lack of ambition, that lack of having a bold vision of let's at least do one thing that will stand the test of time and make a big difference to the extreme poverty that many of the people are living in. It wasn't done. And then you've got the whole infighting within and amongst themselves of the ANC. You've got the corruption. You've got all that, people like, well, not so much, I guess, Becky, but the other one, what was it, Zuma, isn't it? And the women and the accumulation of wealth, that kind of thing. It's demoralizing at times when you think so much could have been done when you had the opportunity, but you didn't seize the day.
Katrina, I've got a question. So that was interesting what you mentioned there about post-Mugabe and arriving in a different mood. What's your take on the mood now?
Oh, I think everybody's gone back to where they were before, and all my family tell me every year that things are worse than they were the year before. And they've told me that for about 20 years now. So I sort of, things are tough, but people find ways, don't they? People hustle. And one way and another, they seem to stay alive on the whole and survive. I really don't know what they do, because what they've got instead with Ed, I think is pretty much the same as what they had with Mugabe. And I think Mugabe, I always feel he's given a very bad press, because I think like a lot of these leaders, they did, and like Mandela, they did a tremendous thing getting their countries to independence. And they went through a lot, and it was a very difficult thing to do. But then they're expected to go on being great heroes that do even more and more after independence. And then frequently they fall short. And obviously Mugabe in the end was not particularly helpful. I don't know where they go, but what I know is that people find ways to muddle through. And a lot of people, they get remittance, don't they, and things as well to help with tough spots. It's the same as it's been for a very long time to me.
Which feels sad to hear in some ways, because people think of change as that opportunity for something better. And then when that doesn't materialise, I think that's something that Gary Young kind of drew out when he was particularly talking about Obama.
To me, when Gary Young, after saying all that he says about, these awful situations that he reports on or he talks about, but then reports on his own life and actually nothing that drastic has happened. I think when I go to Zimbabwe, I first went there in 1984, there's amazing change. People expect to have things that they were still living very village life without almost anything, and no telephone communication and anything. And now, like the rest of the world, they've changed tremendously, and they're very influenced by South Africa. So they've got these little food chains of something that's not McDonald's, but not Kentucky Fry, but something like that. I think they look absolutely horrible. But of course, if people aspire to this sort of thing. You drive along the road and you can see it. I can't believe it that some of my, I have to call them grandchildren, although obviously they're not in our terms here. They've gone to university. They talk like my kids in many respects because of all the access they have to the world media, and some of them are doing quite well, probably at the expense of somebody else. I don't know the details of how that's come about, but so they just go along.
Just as you were saying that, and just reflecting on kind of what I've read, it's almost a question of what does progress really look like. I don't know. It's on the one level, there's this surface, individual progress, economic opportunities, you have access to what everybody else has access to. And then you read about these kind of fundamental systemic biases that Gary Young's talking about, and you're like, people really progressed? Okay, I don't know.
I was just going to say, you mentioned progress. So some people's argument is that progress is when someone like Barack Obama is elected president, when we have people like Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister of this country. So for some people, because that's now happened, we've progressed. There's no such thing as, and even Kemi Badenoch came out and said that, there's really no such thing as institutional racism, because now we have Asian Prime Minister, we have Black ministers who've been in the cabinet. So as far as they're concerned, we've made progress. But Gary Young does say one thing in the book, which I thought was interesting. He says that the presence of underrepresented people in leadership positions only has any significant positive meaning if it challenges whatever obstacles created the conditions for that underrepresentation. Now, I don't think that having all of these people in any of these positions in this country, US, wherever it is that we're talking about, has made any bit of difference to the underrepresented communities. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not progress.
Yeah, it feels surface level. You kind of mentioned
Isn't it a form of progress there?
For who?
Because progress can take many different forms.
But it's only for the individual.
Obama is just one man and was never going to be able to deliver the high expectations that were placed upon his shoulders anyway. Apart from the fact that the party that he came into and the circumstances created so much that he was hampered even where he tried to make certain changes. And that's the same, isn't it? I mean, Rishi Sunak has joined a particular party that has a certain political ideology. So
he very much believes that ideology. He's bought into that ideology as well. There's that infamous clip of him, something about the working class friends. There are working class people there. So
when he accepts he doesn't know any. This is when he was a young man, wasn't he? He was a teenager or something, or a young adult.
I think this is where, and I don't know how much he draws on this, Gary Young, but I think there is this where issues of class and race kind of intersect. And it's very easy to talk about race, but often what gets left out is the class element as well, which has, in some places, has as big a bearing on your opportunities as your race does. So all those individuals you named who have, Jackie, who have done well and who are in the cabinet, they also come from quite well-to-do backgrounds as well. And that's the bit that never gets touched on. Access to money, education. So that's part of what's been able to drive them forward. This idea that this young kid from a council estate in Brixton can be just as bright and get to that same spot. This is where the disconnect comes in for me. And just something you said, Taiwo, just one of my highlights about a piece on Barack Obama's legacy. Gary Young writes, as a candidate, race was central to his meaning, but absent from his message. So, the convenience of him being of colour, but really he had nothing to say about the prospects of Black people across the country writ large. That wasn't why he was elected. Everybody projected that onto him, and then we're disappointed.
But could he have been elected if he tried to make that part of his platform? I mean, that's
probably not, because he was elected because he was non-threatening.
And I think that's part of the reason as to why the likes of Rishi Sunak and Kemi Badenoch are in positions, because they're not rocking the boat, they're agreeing with the status quo. In fact, they're furthering. They're much more militant in their views, these right-wing views.
Yeah.
Because they belong to the school of thought that they've got there, so where are the barriers? Maybe because they are very clever, maybe because they have worked very hard. But the question is about the ordinary average person, isn't it? But I must say, it is difficult to judge progress. And I don't think it's particularly progress just because we happen to have a Prime Minister who's got an Indian heritage. But I was talking, Jackie, because we've spoken before, I've got friends in Austria. I was chatting to somebody there on the phone, and they were saying they really didn't think Austria would be ready for any leader who didn't look pretty much Austrian in their Austrian mind, and that they've got one member of parliament who, I don't know if they call it parliament, whatever it is, their legislative body, who is a Muslim, a lady who sounds like she's more or less given up Islam, certainly doesn't wear hijab or anything, no overt signs. And that's their representation. And so it isn't progress, but I do think this country, when you talk about change, people have become, in many parts of the country, much more used to being around people of different skin colour. Well, it obviously isn't enough, but it has to be a step, I think.
I think I agree with that. You don't get stared at as much as you probably did back in the 60s, 70s. And you don't get chased down the streets, even of London, as you did in the 90s. So I do agree that is some progress. But I think, and Kay, you touched on a really good point on the class versus race issue. And Gary Young does talk a lot about that. I think he was talking about especially class in Katrina, when Hurricane Katrina happened, how it was predominantly the Black people that were affected. They're the ones that ended up dying and also being stuck in that center that they'd set up because they didn't have the cash and they didn't have cars to be able to get out of the way of the hurricane. So it was predominantly Black people. I think he came up with some really harrowing stats. I think 1 in 3 Black people were illiterate in some states. I just thought that was a huge number. And then he said something similar about class and how ethnic minority groups are disproportionately affected. And he was basically talking mainly about COVID. People from ethnic minority groups were 4 times more likely to die from COVID than white people. And I think the first 10 doctors to die were from these groups. Some people are arguing that no, it's a coincidence, COVID doesn't discriminate. But then he was just saying, if you look at the underlying factors, the fact that they were the ones that were working the longer hours, they were the ones that had underlying conditions, high blood pressure, health issues, they're the ones that lived in poverty. So class does play a huge part in how we assess progress. But unfortunately, it also happens that we tend to be at the bottom of the class hierarchy. And so progress just seems to be really, really slow because of that.
Well, this is when, like, the challenge, when they're talking about how do you tackle these issues around race inequality, we've done all the low-hanging fruit stuff, right? We've done the easy things. We can, we'll get a few presenters on TV. We've got people in cabinet. We've done the easy visual stuff. This is when they become, that phrase like wicked problems, when there are so many issues here that have to be addressed. It's not just one thing. And sometimes it's hard to explain. And I do think for some of those things, these are uncomfortable conversations. So I remember that section he wrote about COVID, and perhaps doctors from particular groups feel less comfortable going up and asking for things. They feel less safe in their work, so they're less likely to question when asked to work hours or take shifts which aren't particularly convenient. And all of that together leads up to they're more vulnerable to the impacts of COVID. This is when it becomes, there's so much going on here. And I think Gary Young, again, the thing I like about his writing, he draws those out, but there just don't seem to be any simple solutions to this. Or it's gonna take a bold person or a bold group or a political party willing to put resources behind some of this stuff. Or maybe it isn't for other people. Maybe there is and I think that was one of the frustrating thing about reading this sometimes is you just look at it and you think, so what do we do? I don't know how we get past this. Like, all right, this is just, there's just so much going on here. It's
that kind of boldness, isn't it? That is it Bevan, the guy that set up the NHS? Because most people cannot imagine life in the UK without the NHS, but there was a time when it didn't exist. But it was the boldness of that particular politician, and I don't know all the story, but I guess there must have been quite a lot of obstacles, particularly in the mindset of the people. How can such an institution even exist where it's free at the point of need? But that boldness, that visionary individual is what we really need, isn't it? To address these issues, because they're multifaceted and there's so many factors that, as Kay is saying, need to be drawn together.
And Keir Starmer, ain't it?
You don't believe? No. In my mind, I'm still hoping that he's just playing the dour Debbie Downer. And then when he gets in, he'll be, let's go for it. But I fear not.
I don't think so. But hey, I want to be pleasantly surprised.
Are you saying bring back Boris then? Is that the solution?
Jesus.
Bring back Blair.
Do you know what? I'm with you on that one. I know it's so easy to demonize him for lots of reasons. He worked out how to play the game and he got big things through. And there doesn't seem to be anybody else of that stature who could get through some of those big, bold new ideas. And Gordon Brown as well, let's not forget. I've recently, the past couple of days, I was reading something about the impact of Sure Start. We're still feeling the positive impacts of Sure Start. It needs something that bold, that systemic, that big to shift the dial on some of this stuff. Who's doing that now? I don't want to go on a rant, but oh my goodness, what has happened to like public services in this country? We've just taken money out of public services year after year for the best part of a decade. And then we're all like, I can't believe they're falling apart. Yeah, they're falling apart because we haven't invested in them. And they are the bedrock of... I'll stop.
More like 2 decades.
Yeah, but it's just... Back to your point about who disproportionately suffers, it's the response or the justification of taking a lot of money out of these services, well, people have to pay themselves. And for those of us who can pay ourselves, we've been all right, we've got on with it. But the people who can't, who rely on them services, disproportionately, they do come from particular communities. It is communities of ethnic minorities. It is, in some spaces, it's white working class communities. So you're seeing these particular groups suffer, and you've got the people who come along and say, well, I've been all right. You have, probably because you had wealth to build on. Wealth begets wealth, but...
I'm not sure what that noise was. Did you guys hear it?
Sorry, that was my calendar. Sorry.
All right, okay, cool. I thought maybe it's the platform telling me you guys have been talking enough. Anyhow, 2 things I actually wanted to discuss before we probably end. The first one is this certified list of Uncle Toms.
Is this the where he justifies Uncle Tom?
Yes.
Yeah. I did read that. Yeah.
So in the US, they have this list of certified Uncle Toms. Given what's been happening in the UK recently, can you have such a directory? And should we have such a directory? What is an Uncle Tom anyway?
Which was fascinating, wasn't it? The way in which he showed that actually Uncle Tom wasn't this particularly negative sellout, although it has come to mean that, but it wasn't originally in the Uncle Tom's Cabin or whatever it's called book. But I felt some people that were on the list, I felt some people were hard done by, just because we don't agree with their politics.
Like who?
Well, I fundamentally disagree with that list and the whole concept of it, because I think if you do that, you're shoehorning people who happen to have a particular skin colour into what they're supposed to be. And I don't think you can force people to feel a solidarity with anybody just because, especially in America, which is a country of individualism. And we here in UK have a similar, not quite so extreme perhaps, but a similar approach about individualism. So just not everybody wants to help other people. We wish they would. And if everybody did, we wouldn't be having to worry about the issues of people's colour anyway. I just feel it's fundamentally wrong to say that because you happen to be a black person and you're not doing things which are supporting other black people, it's like I can't accept those sort of divisions. But you may. So
it means that you're not black enough, basically. It means that you're not black enough.
The whole thing, I find it very distasteful and unpleasant. I just think that people who are disadvantaged, it would be a very good idea if everybody else contributes to supporting them. Anyway, that's just me. I feel very, very hostile to that concept.
But damn it, why do I have to support the poor? What do you people do with my taxes? Damn it.
I was just looking back over on some of the names that have been mentioned, and it's one of those terms which has almost come like bastardized. Like I know like sell out, but there's always probably something more behind it. I never feel like I know enough on that. So one of the names on the list is Colin Powell, right? My grandmother was a big fan of Colin Powell. Before she passed away, she liked his story, a black man who made his way up the military And if you read about him afterwards, yes, he went in and served under George Bush. But he did try to push back under some of George Bush. He did try and push back on some of the worst decision making. I think he deliberately went out of his way to try to get the best outcome that he did. Is he an Uncle Tom, really? He immediately is a failure because he served under George Bush. Is that right? I don't recognise that one. Clarence Thomas. And I don't even think it's like someone like Uncle Tom doesn't feel like the right word. I totally understand where you're coming from, Katrina. To me, that's not even someone who's actively not wanting to support. He's actively undermining like progress that has been made and doing it with glee. So it's almost like it's a term for another era. I don't know that it works today. It was an interesting read for me because I'd always heard Uncle Tom. And you know what the truth is? I'd probably use that term, not fully understanding what I meant behind it. But I hadn't realised that in the book he sacrifices himself for another person because he refused. Do you see what I mean? It's one of those terms that is picked up and used. I'm not quite sure that the meaning is always understood or what people are trying to get at is always the same that people think it is, if that makes sense.
I think the meaning that has predominantly been assigned to it is the fact that he didn't support his people, and so he was seen as a sellout. Whereas what Gary was actually trying to say is that actually was he a sellout? He just wanted peace for himself, and he did not deliberately do anything that actually affected Black people in a negative way. It's just that he chose not to stand up where other Black people expected him to stand up. And I do agree with you, having certain people, in fact, actually having people on a list, I think is wrong. I agree with Katrina. I don't think that we should expect things of people just because of the color of their skin. But at the same time, I don't expect a Black person like Kemi Badenoch to go around telling me that my views of racism, for example, or the progress that we've made is wrong because she's in a position of power, because her experience is completely different to the experiences of the majority of Black women in this country. So it's a problematic list, in my view.
You can't overlook the fact that he actually sacrificed his life in order not to give up his fellow enslaved person. Now, that's quite an extreme act of bravery, love, whatever you want to call it, and yet you're still saying that he's an Uncle Tom. That seems a very positive thing to me, to actually lay down your life for another human being.
But I think as you were saying, many people...
Meaning, sorry.
So I was just going to say, I think as you were saying, many people haven't actually read the book and don't know the story. They've just heard the word being used with a negative connotation, and then they picked it up and then just continued using it that way. And which is why I think this book is really good, because it gives you various different perspectives on seeing things. Like, for example, when he was talking about statues, why do we have statues? Why do we need them? I mean, that kind of, and I've never really thought about it. But
particularly statues, though, of people. That's what he was talking about, statues of people rather than of things.
And as I was reading, I'm like, actually, I agree with you. I mean, do we really need these statues?
I thought it was interesting. I think he was talking about the Civil War statues, how the majority of them only went up like 40 to 50 years later. To me, I started out reading it going, and like you, in the end, I was agreeing with a lot of what he was saying. Those were statues to an era of belief rather than... Because if you lived through war, it's the classic thing people say about war. People who live through war don't want to talk about it. It's the generations after who want to talk about it in glowing terms. But if you've actually experienced that, not a nice thing. It's not something you want to go around letting the world know about. But yeah, I agree. I thought that was a really good piece just to challenge what I thought I knew, but didn't really.
Mm-hmm. So finally, I want to close off on a happier note. I can't remember how many they were, but of the people that you interviewed, which interview did you enjoy the most and why? And what did you learn that you didn't already know about these people or about their circumstances? I'll start with you, Taiwo.
You just want me to repeat myself, don't you? I think I learned a lot about Lewis Hamilton that I hadn't known prior, which made me feel, as I said, more compassion and understanding towards him. I did like the interview with Desmond Tutu as well, though, because it always strikes me as someone that radiates joy, very much like a naughty schoolboy, but always seeing the fun and always seeing the beauty in life. I liked Maya Angelou because She just seems like the soul of a party that, if you're having a party, you really want to invite her and everyone will have a good time, but also a very wise woman. Stormzy, yeah. Stormzy was interesting because he just seemed very much committed to his art. And then there was the Angela Davis one as well, wasn't there? Where she was talking about her as a kind of commodification, almost like a symbol, what she represents, her afro, to current generations, which was interesting. It's that whole thing, isn't it, where things start out as being one thing, but they transform into something else. So her and her afro, what it symbolizes, in the same way that the expression, someone being woke, at the time it initially started to gain traction, it meant one thing, but nowadays it can be used as a slur in the same way that an Uncle Tom can be used as a slur. So yes, as I said earlier, the interviews were my favorite parts, getting to know these particular people, getting to understand a bit more about them. Though there is a lot out there because they are quite public figures. But I think he draws them out and you learn a little bit more that you otherwise probably wouldn't have known because of the way he interviews them, which I found very encouraging.
That was probably my favorite section as well. I really, really enjoyed reading about Maya Angelou and also Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin. I'd heard of Claudette Colvin, but I'd never really knew the full extent of the story. And I thought it was quite fascinating how even then, in the middle of the civil rights movement, people were still strategizing, making sure that you have the correct person to represent the movement. And then how this young girl was treated and how she was completely abandoned and then ignored afterwards. And then how she's basically ended up in her last days. I felt a sadness for her because she was brave and she was going places. And I think had she been given the opportunity, she probably would have made a better life for herself. So Stormzy, when I see him, I always think that he's this young, confident man. The self-doubt that came through in that interview, that humanity, that kind of surprised me that he had that self-doubt given how successful he was already at that time. And then the conversation with Maya Angelou, she just sounds like a whole load of fun. If I had, as Taiwo said, if I had to have someone at a dinner party, she would be the one that I would bring along. And the other thing, I like how he managed to tease out a whole lot of bits of information out of her during that interview. So that was a really, really fun section. Lewis Hamilton, again, I didn't know much about him. I don't think I even had an opinion of him before I read the interview. I don't know that I have an opinion of him that I've finished reading the interview. So it was a great section. I absolutely enjoyed it. And Katrina, what did you think?
Like you and Taiwo, there's several people there I really enjoyed reading about. I think most about Stormzy because I suppose I've been thinking he's such a well-known person who, apart from being a singer, seems to be trying to do some good things. But actually, I don't know anything about him, and I'm quite ashamed of this. And it filled in that gap for me to quite a big extent. Yeah, I found him very interesting. And I suppose some of the way he spoke, especially some of his bad language, reminded me of my older son quite a lot, where we have issues about our language, which I probably shouldn't make an issue of. But so I liked reading about him because now I feel I know more about him and I should have known before. Lewis Hamilton, the same. I didn't have any particular knowledge about him except he's a racing driver, so good to know a bit more. And the first one that you mentioned, Claudette Colvin. I mean, Jackie, when you said you don't know so much about Rosa Parks, except obviously what she did, I'm glad to hear you say that because you hear of these people and you kind of know maybe a little, the headline that they're famous for. But when you start to think about it, you actually don't know anything about them really much at all. So, yes, and I'd never heard of Claudette Colvin, although in a sense it stands to reason there would have been other people who'd refused to give up their place on a bus before. There are probably hundreds of people who did that, and some of them got away with it and some of them got chucked off, but we don't know them. So, very interesting section. And I'm better informed a little bit as a result of it.
I like the Stormzy one. I think I'd mentioned a few months ago, I'd just finished reading a book about the history of grime. So I think I liked that he was afforded that kind of level of introspection. Sometimes there's like these judgments about what is culture and what is high art, and it might not be your cup of tea, but he's very good at what he does. And he's the way he's risen to prominence. It wasn't the typical discovered by an A&R and then he gets huge amounts of backing behind him. You know, he clawed his way to position of prominence and the grime and having to be the best in the moment, what have you. So I enjoyed that one, and yeah, just a different side to him. So there is maybe an image of grime artists as being uber confident and nothing can touch them, and they're hard, and they're not. You know, you can be somebody in that industry and who suffers from self-doubt and has something to work through. The Maya Angelou one to me was interesting. I do think if there's one thing that Americans do very well, is they pick their winners and they've got these big myths around them. I do feel like she's one of those authors, maybe along with Toni Morrison, who you're meant to have read all her books because she's an absolutely amazing, and I've read some of them and I didn't find them as half engaging as I think I was supposed to find them. But yeah, it was interesting. I know, terrible of Uncle Tommy, but no, it's it actually does link back slightly to that discussion, because there's the point where there were people she was supposed to like, or she wasn't supposed to like, or she wasn't talked to, and she didn't care about that. And actually, I thought that was a good lesson to take away, because that's what I took ultimately from the Uncle Tom discussion. Is it's unnecessarily divisive in a way that probably hurts Black people who think they think it's helpful to identify these Uncle Toms, and actually it's a discussion that ultimately undermines them. So I liked her single-mindedness about, I will be friends with whoever I want to be friends with. I will talk to whoever I want to talk to. So I like that side of it. And I don't know, I might go back and read more of her books because of it, or one of her books, whichever one anybody recommends.
You've probably read the biographies. I mean, I like Maya Angelou more, not necessarily because of her writing. I love her poems. Mm-hmm. Because I find it very powerful. But her biographies, I've read her biographies, and then I think I've read Mom, Me and I, or something like that. And I like them because they're very accessible. Okay. And I like her biographies mainly because of her story, how she's overcome all these challenges and somehow lived a really happy life. That's why I admire her. Okay. And I can see why Americans hold her up in high esteem.
She had a moment where she spoke at an inauguration.
Clinton.
Yeah, and then she kind of exploded. And I think the same thing happened for another poet recently.
Amanda Gorman.
You're knocking them out the park this week, Toa. Yeah. So all of a sudden they get built up in this way. And then very quickly, I absolutely agree with you, Katrina, about Claudette Colvin. As I was reading that, I almost felt silly for thinking that Rosa Parks was the first. Of course, there are other people who got tired and refused to move. It's the power of a myth, and that strategizing you were talking about, Jacqueline, how important it was to find the right person and then to tell the right story about the right person, and how much we've drunk that Kool-Aid for so many decades until somebody comes along and says, oh yeah, I did that as well. But they just didn't like, it's like, oh yeah, of course. Of course.
It was fascinating though as well, wasn't it? That even the myth of Rosa Parks, how that was managed. Be palatable, because I mean, it was like this little old lady on her way back from church or whatever it was, and was, her sore feet, just too tired to stand up, and so she refused and everything that happened. Whereas really, she was an activist of many years. She was a seasoned political activist and all the rest of it. She, very much into women's rights and all the rest. But when you were talking about unlikely friendships with Maya Angelou, I felt immediately the one that came to mind was Michelle Obama and George Bush.
Are they friends?
Really tight friendship, despite the differences in their political, ideologies. Very tight.
I didn't know that one. Very fascinating. Right, I think we need to draw this to a close. But before we do, how do you feel about the fact that your British accent gives you 20 more points on your IQ if you go to the US?
Yeah, but then me being Black knocks off 20, so I start off in the same position.
It knocks off 15. It knocks off 15, so you're still 5 points ahead.
It definitely is something that gets noted, but it's still, I'm not going to lie, you use it to your advantage sometimes.
You've got to get those points somehow and somewhere. You've got to just get them.
In hand.
Anyway, I think it's entirely justified. I think they should give 20 points, and I think we should all, of course, get 20 points regardless. But obviously the IQ is elevated. Don't we know that?
But also you have to remember that if you're casting a movie in America, the baddie is always going to be a Brit.
Is it?
The villain.
That's all right too.
And all the Black Americans are Brits with good accents.
Anyway, I think we'll close on that. So just going back then to Dispatches from the Diaspora, what would you rate it out of 5 and why?
Well, I'd rate it highly. How should I put it? I think I'd give it a 4. It's full of interesting stuff. Not a difficult read, except some of the content in places, but the style isn't a difficult read. Some of it is very beneficial from a sort of historic general knowledge point of view, and it's enjoyable on the whole, except, as we've said, for some of the more grueling episodes. So yeah, I'd give it a 4 without too much trouble.
I really don't like this bit because there is no rhyme or reasons to my rating. I'm quite sure if somebody was to sit down, it would be the most inconsistent. I would say as a representation of a body of work over career, I think it's pretty amazing. And Gary Young is a writer, like I mentioned before, that I followed. So 5 out of 5 for the writing and the insight and the introspection. I think that's come through in some of this conversation. There's a book to read, just, and I know that sounds weird, but just as something to pick up and read, I'd probably go with 4 out of 5 as well. There are some bits that were a bit hard going in terms of the subject matter. But what I've read, I've enjoyed it. So I'd solidly say 4 out of 5.
I would agree, and I also give it a 4 out of 5. I think I would go as far as saying it's one of the best, actually it is the best book that I've read this year so far. Absolutely enjoyed it. I know I did struggle a bit with the things fall apart section, but it was all very relevant. It needs writing about and it needs talking about. So although it was difficult to read, it's something that I needed to read, and it's something that many people should read. But as a collection, it's a great collection, and everyone should read this book. Absolutely loved it.
I'm going to upgrade to 4 out of 5. I did enjoy it, although I didn't enjoy at least the first half. I didn't enjoy it, but I think that was just me and where my mind was at the time. It really kicked in for me from the interviews. I like the way he ended it. I like the way where he also, in the 5th part, he talked about his parents' background and his family, and I think it was Barbados. Is it Barbados? Yeah, Barbados. So, as Kay has said, as a body of work, he is a remarkable journalist, author, writer, observer of human beings, and he's very insightful. He is also extremely fair and even-handed and balanced, which you don't come across all that often. Many times people either sit on one side or the other of the fence, whereas he's able to look at both viewpoints and not necessarily judge, but just say, these are the facts, these are the pros, these are the cons. So yeah, very good book.
Thank you very much for your very considered views and for your time this afternoon.
And thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this or any of our other episodes, please like, share or subscribe on Spotify, YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Till next time, goodbye.